True love can't grow in a garden of false promises. A jealous cougar bares her claws, then buries the truth.
I've never heard of anything quite like this.
A new bride plans the honeymoon from hell.
He was alive when that car burst into flames around him.
And a cheating girlfriend spins a fatal web of lies.
Just the most outlandish lies and stories that you could ever imagine.
I got that at ground zero.
The three main motivations of murder are money, revenge, and jealousy.
Keep walking, this one's taken.
And that is the ugliest and most powerful of all.
For the close-knit community of West Liberty, Iowa, the Bar and Grill is the heart and soul of the town.
Thanks, man.
And single mom Annette Cahill is its best customer.
She essentially was what you might call a barfly.
Not unusual for people to be on shaky ground after a divorce and drink too much, party too much, and that's exactly what happened with Annette.
Her life turns into this: sex, drugs, rock and roll, party all night.
Another familiar face at the bar is 17-year-old Corey Winnicky.
Thanks, Matt.
He hasn't even finished high school,
Hey.
but he's got quite a reputation.
Corey's a ladies' man.
Come here. Why don't you show me that dance you were telling me about?
He had relationships with numerous women, and those relationships often were at the same time.
Ready?
I'm ready.
I'm on the way. I'm on the way. Score, Corey, score.
Well, he's a player. He's playing all of these women.
Score, Corey, score.
He was 16 years of age. She would have been in her early 20s when they first met.
Despite Annette and Corey's age difference, these two forces of nature inevitably collide.
Why have a girl?
The results are explosive.
When you can have a real woman.
Well, I wouldn't mind that at all.
Maybe I'll show you a thing or two.
Let's get out of here.
Thus begins an interesting relationship.
It was one big party.
Thanks, Matt. Take care.
Until in 1991, one of Corey's other girlfriends drops a bombshell.
Compliments in the house.
Not today, Corey.
Not surprisingly, one of his girlfriends became pregnant.
Wendy was not necessarily trying to have a long-term relationship with Corey, other than the fact that they shared a child together.
Annette decides it's time she marks her territory.
Keep walking, this one's taken.
The cougar sinks in her claws.
She's pregnant.
Annette was thinking that this relationship was going to bloom into something that it wasn't.
What about our plans?
All of a sudden, Annette becomes this jealous lover.
What plans?
In her mind, Corey ultimately is going to be all hers.
To get away.
Annette is done sharing her man. She has a plan to make him all her own.
To move to Missouri.
Annette told people that she and Corey were going to leave Iowa, go to Missouri, buy their own bar, and that was going to be their life.
You're crazy.
That became her dream, that they were going to move away.
There was no evidence of this at all. It was in her head.
This was simply just an Annette fantasy.
October 12th, 1992.
Bottoms up!
Marks the beginning of the end. Annette and Corey are sharing a shift at the bar and grill.
She was supposed to be helping, but she got very intoxicated.
No more.
the glass.
No.
He was not interested in a relationship with her at all. He was annoyed by her being around.
Hey. Can you do me a favor? I need you to get her home. She's wasted. Can you please just get her home? I can't.
She was drunk, was kind of being obnoxious. He was trying to get rid of her.
Annette leaves, but doesn't go far.
But Corey comes out, he's not alone.
He was with Wendy, the mother of his child. Annette didn't take it well.
Annette and Corey have an argument.
What is she doing here?
But with Wendy sitting in the Cadillac watching all of this. And Corey announces that he's going to drop Annette off at her house, and then he's going to give Wendy a ride to her place.
Why do you guys pay a little bit of attention to me like you used to?
What do you think I was doing for 3 years?
Well, why does it have to end?
This means that he's gonna drop her off. He's gonna go sleep with Wendy.
Corey didn't understand women at all. Love triangles are extremely dangerous. The whole jealousy thing can go either way. Someone was going to die. It was either going to be Wendy or Corey.
In West Liberty, Iowa, Annette Cahill is losing her hold over young lover Corey Winnicky.
It appears to me that Annette was very much in love with Corey.
But Corey isn't in love with Annette.
And that might have pushed her over the edge.
But now she's becoming full of rage.
In the early hours of October 13th, 1992, Annette arrives at Corey's house, armed with a baseball bat.
There's Corey in his bed, sound asleep. And Annette doesn't say a word. She takes that bat and she begins beating him savagely.
Tried to protect himself and rolled off onto the floor next to the bed.
Annette was venting her rage. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you. Every time she hit him.
Annette rains down a total of 12 blows.
And that's when she delivers that fatal blow to the back of his head, crushing his skull like a coconut.
No one in town can imagine who would want to kill one of its most popular and promising young residents.
There were several different theories that were thrown out. You know, it was a gambling debt, it was a drug debt, and all of those theories were chased down, and nothing came out of them.
One by one, those closest to Corey are eliminated as suspects.
Annette was questioned by the police, but she was able to talk her way out of trouble.
The investigation moves on, and so does Annette. She transforms her life.
Stopped drinking, found a decent man, settled down, raised her children.
A model citizen, Annette gets away with murder for 25 years. Until 2017, when a detective on an unrelated case at the University of Iowa Hospital is approached by an ICU nurse.
Excuse me, sir? Sir!
Yes?
You can't be here. This isn't a public area.
Oh, Detective Trent Valenta.
I'm so sorry. They told me you were coming. You want more Tubi?
36-year-old Jessie Becker has been haunted by Corey's murder for decades because she knows who did it.
Great, that way? Thanks.
Sorry, but before you go, do you know anyone who investigates cold cases?
It's your lucky day. I specialize in cold cases.
Now, this detective just happens to be the cold case squad leader for the entire state.
Here's my card. Give me a call tomorrow.
I will. Thank you.
And she tells him about what she saw when she was a kid.
Several weeks after the murder, and 9-year-old Jessie Becker goes for a sleepover to her friends, who just happens to be Annette's niece.
Annette is living at her brother's house. She's babysitting her niece and young Jessie.
In the middle of the night, the girls go downstairs in search of a midnight snack.
As they sit in the shadows and watch what's going on,
in that living room, Annette has black candles lit.
Oh, what did I do? What did I do? Corey. Oh, I love you, Corey. I'm sorry.
Annette was crying and was apologizing to Corey for killing him.
I'm sorry, Corey. I didn't mean to kill you.
she's saying, Corey, I'm sorry. Corey, I love you. Corey, I didn't mean to kill you.
At that point, she had gotten away with murder, but felt bad about what she had done. Even trying to convince herself she didn't mean to kill Corey. She hit him 12 times with a baseball bat.
They've just heard a confession of a murder.
Decades on, the recollections of a 9-year-old girl reignite this ice-cold case.
Of all the homicides I've studied over the last 40 years, I've never heard of anything quite like this.
And it all starts adding up. It's like A goes to B, goes to C, goes to Annette.
She's a killer who almost got away with it. She's a killer who thought that she could put it all behind her. And one day, we came looking for her.
Miss Cahill,
Yes.
you're under arrest for the murder of Corey Winecki. Come with me.
After her first trial ends in a hung jury, in 2019, Annette Cahill is convicted of second-degree murder. She's sentenced to 50 years in prison.
It took one witness to open this case back up, and ultimately we got her put where she needs to be.
Corey had no idea who he was dealing with when it came to Annette. He thought she was a good time girl. In fact, she was a deadly woman. This is a murder motivated by one of the most common reasons. 5-letter word, starts with a G, ends in R-E-E-D.
And they became friends right away.
To the strapping young newlyweds. Third time lucky for both of you.
Margaret and Patrick were friends for over a year, and then the relationship changed to a romantic one.
To Mr. and Mrs. Plum.
Cheers. Or so it seemed.
Just 2 days later, the newlyweds face their first marital hurdle.
Hello?
Hi, can I speak to Patrick, please?
He's not here. I'm his wife.
Patrick had put a deposit down on a piece of property miles and miles away.
Port Macquarie. Is this some kind of joke?
Margaret was not happy.
I don't care what he did. It's not happening.
Patrick never told her that he had any plans to buy property. or any plans at all to move.
Margaret was happy living where they were. She had family and friends there.
What's the problem now?
Port Macquarie, when were you going to tell me?
It was meant to be a surprise.
Patrick had been drinking, he was drunk, and he and his new bride had an argument.
Well, it's not happening.
I've already paid the deposit.
And I withdrew it this morning. What were you thinking, you stupid man?
It's pretty heated.
How dare you don't you?
Patrick storms out, leaps in his car, and he drives off.
At 9 p.m. that night, along a lonely back road, a tragedy unfolds.
A passerby saw the flames and called the police.
Yeah, there's a car on fire just off Adams Road. You might want to send your blokes out. Yeah, will do.
The driver is still in the vehicle.
There's nothing the passerby can do. The car is well and truly on fire.
The incinerated corpse is identified as the newly married Patrick Plum. The cause of the accident seems clear.
Patrick's blood alcohol was 0.18, 3 times the legal limit. So somebody running into a tree in that condition was not at all surprising.
He was drinking, he had too much, he had a car accident. So sad.
Newlywed 1 minute, widow the next. But Margaret's marriage is not one of those made in heaven.
In early April, Margaret says to this friend that really she doesn't much like Patrick. In fact, she hates him, not her type at all.
She really hated Patrick, but she was going to marry him.
Margaret has her reasons for marrying a man she doesn't like.
Oh, why don't you fellas go and pop the barbecue on? I'm starving.
And they all end in zero.
Patrick's got an estate. He's $400,000 in cash, about $600,000 in superannuation.
Patrick is a millionaire.
And importantly, Patrick apparently doesn't have any relatives to whom he can leave it.
Even at the wedding, Margaret makes no secret of her motives.
Margaret's friend said, Patrick doesn't look like a happy man.
Oh, well, the ring's on the finger now. And I'm the only family he has.
As soon as Margaret said, I do, she saw his money as her money.
The very next day, she makes sure to get that in writing.
The day after the wedding, Patrick made it official. Margaret would be his sole beneficiary.
Come on.
Patrick makes a new will and he signs over everything he's got to his new bride of 24 hours.
Done. Happy?
Mm-hmm. He didn't see a problem with this. His antenna should have gone up.
Within 24 hours, Patrick is dead.
People feel sorry for Margaret. They've only been married a couple of days.
Friends offer support, including an old boyfriend, Tony.
There you go. No milk, but a bit of cold water to top it off.
Oh, you remembered.
How could I forget?
Margaret can't keep the secret any longer.
So how are you holding up?
The truth?
There's only one reason Margaret married Patrick.
I'm fine. I'm glad he's gone.
And it was to get his money as fast as she could.
If I tell you something, promise to take it to your grave?
Okay, I'll promise.
She just needed to get rid of him.
"58-year-old Margaret Vandergulik is a newlywed widow. But only she knows the truth about the horrific accident that killed 60-year-old husband, Patrick Plum.
There was no accident.
Police thought it was an accident, but their friends thought it was an accident. Patrick's family thought it was an accident. Well, no, it wasn't. She had organised it.
He burned to death in the fire.
A week after Patrick's death, she makes a stunning admission.
I didn't. I killed him.
Just couldn't resist telling her ex-boyfriend what she'd done.
Sometimes people confess murder because they feel bad. They have a lot of guilt. I don't think that's what was going on here.
Best decision I ever made.
I think Margaret might have been bragging.
It begins with that phone call.
Hello?
On April 28th, 2005.
He's not here. I'm his wife.
When Patrick got home, there was hell to pay.
What were you thinking, you stupid man?
They have this argument about him potentially buying another property.
These decisions are made together. This is a marriage. How dare you go and make a decision like this behind my back?
But the argument doesn't end with Patrick driving away, as Margaret claims.
She hit him over the head out of anger. She wanted to hurt him. Patrick fell and hit his head on the stove.
Patrick's skull is fractured, and he's unconscious. Margaret believes she's killed him, or so she says.
Margaret was a nurse. She would know the difference between somebody that was unconscious or dead. She knew he was alive.
According to Margaret, she panics, she wraps him in a blanket, gets him into the car.
She drove out to a remote country road. She put Patrick in the driver's seat.
Then douses the truck in gasoline.
She orchestrates the whole thing to look like an accident.
With the truck in neutral, she wedges a dumbbell against the gas pedal.
Put it in gear and let it run smack into a tree.
The minor impact is not enough to kill Patrick.
Patrick was alive when Margaret put that dumbbell on the accelerator and sent the car into the tree. He was alive when that car burst into flames around him.
Everyone agrees it was an accident.
Right now, she thinks she got away with it completely.
Her ex-boyfriend reluctantly agrees to keep her secret.
To your grave.
Yeah, okay.
Some people, I guess, just want to big note themselves. They want to boast. I got away with it. Because at that stage she had, and she had the money.
The grieving widow uses her $1 million inheritance to take the holiday of a lifetime.
I've got these in Morocco. In the old Medina of theirs. This one's my favourite.
This was no time for her to sit home and cry. She went on a trip around the world.
Actually happened.
Obviously, she trusted that he wasn't going to tell anyone. She was wrong.
Instead of a coroner's inquest, police mount a murder investigation.
Margaret immediately becomes not a grieving widow, but a suspect in murder.
Margaret counters Tony's accusations with some of her own.
She started claiming to the police that Tony had threatened her life, that Tony was planning to kill her.
If I don't get killed or shot in the next few weeks, I'll be very surprised.
Saying, you know, he's my ex, he was angry that I got married, he's a liar, he's unreliable, he's making death threats against me.
He's threatened to shoot me. It's like he's gone insane.
She was trying to undermine his credibility. It was a stupid thing to do.
To support her claims, Margaret resorts to even greater stupidity.
Margaret took a .22 caliber rifle and shot herself in the upper arm. She told police that Tony had shot me.
Margaret spends 5 days recovering in the hospital.
It was so very obvious that it was a self-inflicted wound, that it didn't fool anybody.
A new autopsy finally reveals the truth.
Margaret Van Gulik, put your hands behind your back.
And in June 2006, 14 months after the murder, Margaret is arrested.
When the cops approached her to arrest her,
Do you really think I'd be that bloody stupid to kill my husband days after marrying him?
she said, "Do you think I'm stupid?"
The day after he made me his sole benefactor.
When a suspect says to the police, "Would I be that stupid?" the answer is usually, yes, you would.
Margaret pleads not guilty to murder, but guilty to the reduced charge of manslaughter. In 2009, she's sentenced to 9 years in jail. With parole, she serves only 6. And in 2014, Margaret Van Gulik walks free from prison.
Personally, I think is a remarkably lenient sentence. All the indicators were there that it was premeditated.
6 years for taking someone's life and their money. Was justice served in this case? I do not believe it was. If a psychopath isn't using and abusing someone that loves them,
This way, turn to this.
something's wrong. They're not good at their job.
Villa Park, Chicago, Illinois. In the winter of 2006, 26-year-old Nicole Abu Sharif
Hey, you.
has a new love in her life. 19-year-old Rose Sidaro.
Nicole and Rose met initially on a car forum. I believe they were both enthusiasts of the Ford Mustang.
I guess they hit it off and they met, and then they started getting involved physically.
Nicole is out to impress young Rose.
Well, pretty much everything that Nicole said to Rose was a lie.
I got that at Ground Zero.
Tried to basically ensnare her into a relationship by making up just the most outlandish lies and stories that you could ever imagine.
You were there? I'll never forget.
She said that she's a firefighter.
I was a first responder.
She had friends who were firefighters who were killed in the course of heroic actions.
Oh my God.
She was trying to manipulate Rose in any way she could to make Rose feel sorry for her.
For almost a year, Nicole keeps Rose captivated with an ever-growing web of lies.
This way, turn to this.
I was a prosecutor for 30 years, and I really didn't see anybody that lied to the extent that this woman did.
Nicole isn't just telling lies, she's living one. She's cheating on her long-term girlfriend, 32-year-old Becky Klein.
Becky was a nurturer, a giver, a kind, generous person who devoted her life to helping those that needed assistance.
For 8 years, Becky and Nicole have lived as a married couple.
Becky and Nicole decided to commit themselves to each other.
They had a monogamous relationship, and they had actually bought a home together.
I'm so happy. Me too.
Becky truly trusted Nicole and was devoted to her.
We finally have our own home. Now we just need a family.
Becky is already planning their next chapter.
She had indicated that she wanted to have children with Nicole, but Nicole was not interested in having children.
Nicole's planning her future with Rose.
Nicole started seeing Rose more and more often. She was communicating with her all the time.
In early 2007, Nicole is off work with a back injury.
She was kind of an insurance scam artist, like a workman's comp case where she said she slipped and fell, or a car crash where she exaggerated injuries, or another one where she said she got hit in the head.
She just was bent and twisted.
For months, Nicole lives a double life.
Morning.
You're going to work early today?
Big day, taking some of the clients out.
Becky has no idea of the depth of Nicole's betrayal.
Be good.
Always.
Nicole was brazen enough.
Do you want to come over?
To bring Rose into the home she owned with Becky.
She was desperately trying to keep hold of Rose and make Rose think that she was some wonderful person worthy of spending the rest of her life with.
It's my housemate.
And how come I haven't met her?
She works odd shifts, so she's barely home.
But nothing she tells her is true.
She did not know that Nicole was in a relationship.
Before the cancer comes back, I want to look after you.
Don't say that.
Nicole would talk about how she was dying of cancer and she didn't have long to live.
Then, in March 2007, Nicole makes Rose an offer she knows she can't refuse.
I think that's why we should get our own place.
Oh yeah? With what?
I've got money. I'll buy you a house.
She told Rose she wanted to start a new life with her. There were just two problems. She didn't have any money, and she was with Becky.
Nicole has a plan that will solve both problems.
To continue a relationship with Rose and get Becky out of the way.
Becky was trusting, innocent, naive. She had no idea she was in love with a cold-hearted killer.
In Villa Park, Illinois, Nicole Abou-Sharif plans to trade her long-term partner, Becky, for her new lover, Rose. But Nicole doesn't want to split their assets. She wants to cash in on Becky's life insurance policy.
By getting the life insurance policy that she had on Becky's life and to get their home and their cash and all their property.
Nicole was looking to get away with in excess of $400,000.
You here to help?
I'd rather play.
We haven't done anything like this in a while.
Becky was thinking that this was just a game between the two of them, tricked into allowing herself to be blindfolded.
Stay there.
Not too terribly tight, such that it could have been perceived as a game.
What are you doing?
It's a surprise.
This appears to me that Nicole put a lot of thought into it.
Her hands are duct taped behind her back.
Please, Nicole, this isn't funny.
Just stay calm.
Nicole tied the gag around Becky's mouth.
Nicole was able to get Becky to actually get in the trunk of a car.
Becky, get in the trunk now!
Hog-tied with her hands taped behind her back, and would have been just easy to put a bag over her head.
This is no game. This is murder.
It wasn't until the bag was actually placed over her head that it became much more serious for Becky. The bag was tied multiple times with duct tape.
I could not imagine what went on in Becky's head. She must have been terrified, poor thing.
She suffocated in a slow manner.
She showed not the slightest bit of sympathy or empathy for Becky, who she supposedly loved.
A psychopath feels no remorse or guilt when they hurt another person.
Nicole leaves Becky's body in the trunk.
It's just disgusting. She's such an evil evil person.
Oh, really?
She heads straight into the arms of her new love, Rose, and presents her with a bizarre gift.
Got a kick-ass present for you. I want you to have the Mustang.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Plan may have been to frame Rose Sidaro with the body being found in the trunk while Rose was driving that car.
We really never got to the bottom of what was going on in her mind. But definitely some evil, creepy, lying setup she had going on.
The alarm is raised when Becky fails to show up for work. Nicole has just enough time to plant one crucial piece of evidence.
She takes Becky's work van, moved it half a block away down the street to make it look like Becky was kidnapped.
Police examine the van, but find no evidence of a crime.
The keys were in the car. There was a laptop found in the car. There were personal items found in the car, and nothing appeared to have been taken.
Her story soon begins to unravel.
What happened last night?
It's just a quiet night watching TV.
Nicole put a lot of thought into this murder, but she didn't put a lot of thought into how to deal with the police investigation.
When I found out that she didn't turn up to work, that's when I went looking for her.
The police were getting more and more suspicious of everything that Nicole was telling them.
She's not here.
Every lie that she told, they were essentially able to determine was not, in fact, what happened.
You okay if we look around?
Why? Go ahead.
She also left something behind of Becky's that was very important. Who leaves their house without their cell phone?
When police check Becky's incoming calls, they make a startling discovery.
Her spouse was missing since 7:30 in the morning. Nicole never even called her.
Not very smart.
But Nicole makes numerous calls to another number that day, Rose Sidaro.
That's her, right?
Yeah.
Once the police discovered that Nicole was having an affair, a whole new world of investigative venues opened up to them.
Rose, how do you know Nicole?
She's my girlfriend.
A domestic murder where there's a love triangle, that motive is as old as time.
Police establish Rose has no knowledge of Becky's disappearance. But she does tell them about Nicole's extravagant gift of the vintage Mustang. It's the one place in the house police haven't searched.
They asked Nicole if she had keys to the trunk. Nicole insisted that she never had keys to the trunk.
They then search her house and they find right on her key ring the trunk key. She's just an unbelievable liar.
A missing person case becomes a murder investigation. And finally, Nicole's treachery is fully exposed.
There was an abundance of physical evidence.
Nicole has even left clear fingerprints on the duct tape wrapped around Becky's neck.
And it was really an incredible piece of evidence. It was a nail in the coffin for her.
In 2009, Nicole Abu Sharif is convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison. She won't be eligible for parole until the age of 76.
I think Nicole was a total sociopath. I mean, she's just pure evil.
Incredibly cold, manipulative user who would do anything to anyone to benefit herself.
Love can be blind, but if someone is in love with a psychopath, they're not going to know it until it's too late.
These deadly women were skilled in the art of deception. Annette Cahill
The desert was already awake when the phone rang, a dry wind scraping against trailers and storefronts as if trying to erase whatever had happened overnight. And when officers arrived at the edge of the highway just outside Flagstaff, they found a scene that felt unfinished, as though someone had interrupted a story mid-sentence and walked away. A car sat abandoned on the shoulder, driver's door open, engine cold, no blood, no struggle obvious at first glance, just silence stretching across the sand. The woman who had been driving it was gone, and in Arizona, disappearance carries a different weight, because the land itself knows how to keep secrets. Her name would be spoken carefully at first, then urgently, then endlessly. 26 years old. Worked 2 jobs. No known enemies. She had called her sister the night before, said she was tired, said she'd be home soon, said nothing that sounded like a goodbye. By morning, she was missing, and by noon, the word cold case had already begun to hover in the background, unspoken but waiting. The initial search was fast, loud, and perfect. Volunteers lined up along the highway, scanning brush and ravines. Helicopters cut slow circles over rock and scrub. Deputies questioned gas station clerks, truck drivers, anyone who might have seen a lone woman pulled over in the dark. Tips came in immediately. Too many of them. A man arguing on the roadside. A pickup seen idling. A scream that may have been an engine backfiring. Each lead collapsed under daylight. Inside the car, investigators found nothing dramatic. A purse still on the passenger seat. Keys in the ignition. No signs of forced entry. It was the kind of scene that resists narrative, offering no obvious villain, no clear moment where everything went wrong. That absence would define the case. The community reacted with a mix of fear and disbelief. This was not supposed to happen here. Not to someone ordinary. Not without noise. Parents kept children home. Women stopped driving alone at night. The desert, once familiar, began to feel like an accomplice. Detectives worked the angles they knew. Boyfriends. Co-workers. Exes. None of them broke. Alibis held. Backgrounds were clean. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the search shifted from urgent to procedural. Posters faded. Tips slowed. The case file grew thicker, but not clearer. Somewhere in that transition, something subtle happened. Evidence was boxed. Reports were filed. The urgency cooled. No one said the words out loud, but the case began to settle into a colder state, preserved rather than pursued, waiting for something that no one could yet define. Years passed. New crimes demanded attention. New detectives inherited old questions without context. The woman's name was still there in the system, but it was quieter now, less likely to surface unless someone went looking for it on purpose. What no one realized in 1995 was that the most important piece of this case had already been collected, logged, and forgotten, sitting silently among dozens of others, waiting for a future that did not yet exist. And while the desert continued to do what it does best, erase footprints, scatter traces, keep its silence, the case was not dead. It was only sleeping, frozen in time, a cold case that would one day wake up and turn everything upside down. By the third week, the desert had returned to its routines, heat rising in visible waves off the asphalt, traffic flowing past the abandoned stretch of highway as if nothing had ever broken the rhythm there, and that was when the investigation began to feel the first real shift, not toward answers, but toward uncertainty solidifying into something heavier. Detectives replayed the timeline again and again, minute by minute, searching for a moment where control slipped, where a choice narrowed into inevitability, but the timeline resisted them, smooth and unbroken, offering no obvious fracture. They went back to the car. Again. The same dust on the dashboard. The same faint scent of air freshener mixed with desert air. The same ordinary details that felt almost insulting in their normalcy. A receipt in the cup holder. A cassette tape left half ejected. Nothing screamed violence. Nothing explained disappearance. That absence began to feel intentional, as if whoever had intervened understood exactly how little was needed to make a person vanish. Witness statements were revisited with fresh ears. A trucker who remembered headlights pulled off too far from the shoulder. A waitress who thought she saw the missing woman earlier that night, nervous, distracted, glancing toward the door. A gas station clerk who hesitated, then said maybe she'd been with someone, maybe not. Memory softened under pressure. Certainty dissolved. The family pushed forward where the system slowed. They organized searches beyond official boundaries, walked washes and canyons where no patrol car could go, calling her name into spaces that swallowed sound without response. They learned quickly how vast the land really was, how easily it could absorb a human presence without leaving a mark. Every mile walked felt like both effort and surrender. Inside the department, the case began to attract labels. No forced entry. No ransom. No body. That combination placed it in a narrow, uncomfortable category where statistics offered little comfort. Voluntary disappearance was mentioned, then dismissed, then mentioned again, not because anyone believed it, but because the alternatives were worse. A detective noticed something small, almost trivial. The position of the driver's seat. It was set slightly farther back than the woman's height would suggest. Not enough to be proof. Just enough to be unsettling. Was it adjusted by someone else? Or had she always driven that way? No one could say for certain. The detail went into the file, highlighted, then buried under more immediate concerns. Media attention flared and faded. Headlines used the phrase cold case cautiously at first, then more freely as days passed without progress. The community read those words with a mix of dread and resignation. Cold meant forgotten. Cold meant unanswered. Cold meant the desert had won. Detectives pursued a lead involving a similar disappearance 2 counties over. A woman pulled off the road late at night, her car found intact. For a brief moment, patterns seemed to form. Then timelines failed to align. Evidence refused to cooperate. The connection dissolved, leaving behind only the echo of possibility. Budget meetings happened. Resources shifted. Personnel changed. The case remained, but its priorities slipped incrementally, not through negligence, but through arithmetic. There were only so many hours. Only so many detectives. Only so much pressure the system could sustain without results. The woman's family felt that shift immediately. Phone calls were returned more slowly. Updates grew vague. Phrases like, "No new developments," became routine. They learned the language of stagnation, how it sounds professional while meaning nothing at all. Years later, one investigator would admit that this was the moment the case truly became cold, not when evidence ran out, but when belief did. When the idea that answers were imminent quietly expired. What no one said aloud was that the case still had a pulse. Faint, irregular, but alive. Somewhere, sealed in an evidence bag marked with a date and a case number that no longer triggered urgency, was an item no one yet knew how to read properly. It had been collected in good faith, processed with the best tools available at the time, and dismissed without ceremony. Not because it lacked value, but because the future had not arrived yet. The desert kept its silence. The file stayed on the shelf. And the story continued to wait. Time does not announce when it begins to work against an investigation. It simply stretches, thinning urgency until it becomes routine, and by the end of the first year the Arizona case had slipped into that quiet, dangerous phase where nothing is technically closed, but nothing is actively moving either. The missing woman's name still appeared on whiteboards, still surfaced in meetings, but always at the bottom, always after newer crimes demanded immediate answers. Detectives rotated off. New ones rotated in. Each handoff cost the case something intangible, a tone, a suspicion, a half-formed instinct that never made it into the reports. Files were read, then reread, but without the original emotional weight. What once felt alarming now felt ambiguous. What once felt urgent now felt historical. The car was released from impound. It had been processed multiple times, photographed, dusted, vacuumed, swabbed. Nothing definitive had emerged. The decision to release it was framed as procedural, but it marked a psychological line. Evidence that leaves custody rarely returns with the same authority. The family objected, quietly at first, then loudly. They feared contamination, loss, forgetting. They were told everything possible had already been done. The system spoke in certainty. The family heard finality. Rumors began to circulate. In a vacuum of facts, speculation thrives. Some said she had been targeted. Others said she knew someone dangerous. A few suggested she staged her own disappearance, pointing to deaths that did not exist, arguments that were exaggerated beyond recognition. Each rumor chipped away at clarity, replacing evidence with narrative. A retired highway patrol officer remembered something out of sequence. A call that came in late that night about a vehicle pulled over farther south. Lights off, someone standing beside it. The report had been logged, then cleared when no follow-up call came. The location was close enough to matter. The timing was close enough to haunt. The memory was vague enough to be useless. It went into the supplemental file, unverified, unprovable. The desert yielded nothing. Seasonal floods shifted sand, erased tracks, buried whatever might once have been visible. Search areas expanded, then contracted, then closed entirely. Nature did what it does best when given time. It removed evidence without malice. By the mid-2000s, the case had become shorthand inside the department. A reference point. The one that went nowhere. The one with no body. The one with a car. New detectives learned about it not through briefings, but through hallway conversations, lowered voices, an unspoken understanding that some cases simply refused resolution. The family marked anniversaries with silence rather than ceremony. They stopped expecting calls. They stopped reading every article about missing persons. Hope did not vanish. It hardened. It became something they carried privately, no longer shared with institutions that could not sustain it. What remained active, though no one could see it, was the evidence itself. It sat preserved under standards that would soon become outdated, labeled, sealed, forgotten, but intact. At the time, it had been examined for what it could say then. No one asked what it might say later. This was the quietest part of the story. No press. No searches. No suspects. Just time, accumulating, altering context without changing facts. The case did not deteriorate. It aged. And in that aging, something essential remained untouched, waiting for a moment when silence would no longer be enough to keep it hidden. By the time the calendar turned again, the case existed almost entirely in paper, stacked reports and faded photographs standing in for a woman whose absence had outlived the urgency that once surrounded her name, and yet something about the file continued to resist closure, not through answers, but through imbalance, the sense that too many pieces remained suspended without gravity. An internal review surfaced inconsistencies that had been invisible when the investigation was fresh. Timelines overlapped in ways that no one had questioned. Witness statements contradicted each other on details that should have aligned. A gas station receipt placed the woman miles away from where she was believed to have been at a specific hour. The discrepancy was small, almost dismissible, but it suggested movement where none had been accounted for. Detectives traced that receipt to a station that no longer existed. The clerk had moved out of state. The surveillance tapes were long gone. Another potential window closed without noise. A profiler consulted on the case offered a theory that unsettled everyone involved. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was controlled. The lack of struggle, the absence of chaos, the precision of the disappearance pointed towards someone who knew how to minimize attention, how to operate within seconds, how to remove a person without leaving a spectacle behind. That theory narrowed the field and expanded it at the same time. Attention returned briefly to long-haul drivers, to transit workers who passed through without leaving routes. Lists were compiled. Names were checked. Records were incomplete. Jurisdictions failed to align. The desert corridor was too wide, the flow of traffic too constant. Patterns dissolved as quickly as they formed. The family received another update that changed nothing. No suspects. No remains. No confirmation of life or death. The absence of certainty became its own kind of cruelty, forcing them to live in a suspended state where mourning felt premature and hope felt irresponsible. Inside the evidence room, boxes were moved, shelves were reorganized, labels rewritten for clarity rather than urgency. During that process, an item from the original collection was briefly re-examined, not for answers, but for compliance with new storage standards. It was noted. It was logged. It was returned to its place without comment. No one realized its significance had not diminished. Only the tools had. Public interest flickered when a journalist revisited the case, framing it as a forgotten mystery, a cold case that still haunted the edges of the state's collective memory. Calls came in again. Old tips resurfaced. Names long cleared were whispered anew. None of it held. The noise subsided as quickly as it returned. Years continued their steady work. Leadership changed. Policies evolved. The case remained, patient and unresolved, held in stasis by procedure rather than pursuit. What made the file unsettling was not what it contained, but what it refused to offer. No closure. No release. Just the persistent suggestion that the truth was not absent, only unreadable. And as the desert continued to erase the surface of the past, the real story stayed buried somewhere much closer, sealed in plain sight, waiting for the moment when the system would finally learn how to listen. The case did not disappear. It thinned. Like a radio signal drifting farther from the source, still present but harder to tune, it remained in the system as a name and a number, resurfacing only when someone deliberately searched for it, and even then it offered resistance, as if daring anyone to claim understanding without consequence. A new detective encountered the file by accident, pulled from a shelf while looking for something else, its thickness unexpected, its contents heavier than the label suggested. He read it not with the urgency of the original investigation, but with distance, and distance allowed patterns to emerge that closeness had obscured. He noticed repetition where there should have been clarity, assumptions made early that were never revisited, conclusions reached because the alternative was too uncomfortable to hold open indefinitely. He returned to the earliest hours, not to find answers, but to listen for silence. The absence of witnesses at a highway pull-off in the early morning hours. The lack of reported sounds. The way the car was positioned, angled slightly inward, as if pulled over intentionally rather than forced. That detail had been recorded, then dismissed as subjective. It no longer felt that way. The detective requested access to the evidence again, not for reprocessing, but for inventory. What was still there? What was intact? What had survived the years? Each item was examined with care, less like a search for answers and more like an audit of possibility. One object stood out not because it was dramatic, but because it had been overlooked so completely. A small trace, collected as a matter of routine, categorized, logged, and then forgotten because it failed to speak when first asked to. At the time, it had been tested for what investigators thought it should reveal. It revealed nothing. The file recorded that fact and moved on. Technology had moved on as well. Quietly, without announcement. The detective knew this, and the knowledge unsettled him. Evidence does not change. The ability to interpret it does. He requested a review, not a reopening. Not yet. just a reassessment under current standards. The request moved slowly through channels, weighed against workload, resources, priority. Eventually, permission was granted, framed as administrative rather than investigative. The family was notified carefully. No promises. No expectations. Just the acknowledgement that the case was not closed, only dormant. The words were chosen with precision, but hope does not require invitation. It arrives unannounced, cautious but persistent. The evidence was transported, handled with procedures that did not exist in 1995. Chain of custody was reaffirmed. Documentation updated. Nothing outward changed, but the balance shifted. For the first time in years, the case was not being remembered. It was being tested. The laboratory was quiet in the way places become quiet when expectation outweighs activity, a controlled stillness where every movement feels deliberate, and when the evidence arrived it did so without ceremony, sealed, labeled, carrying nothing of the urgency it once demanded, because urgency belongs to people, not objects. The technicians treated it as routine, another item among hundreds, another request queued behind more recent crimes that still bled into the present. And yet, something about this submission carried a different tension. It came from a case that time had failed to erase. A cold case, revived not by a confession or a tip, but by doubt. The kind of doubt that grows sharper the longer it is ignored. The testing began with no expectation of revelation. That is how most breakthroughs actually start, not with confidence, but with procedure. Swabs were prepared. Controls were set. Data was logged. Machines hummed without drama. For days, nothing happened. Meanwhile, the detective returned to the file, re-examining interviews through a new lens. He noticed how often witnesses had described the same moment differently, not because they were lying, but because memory bends under pressure. He noticed how early assumptions had guided later questions, narrowing answers before they were spoken. He noticed how quickly the investigation had moved away from the possibility of a second location, as if acknowledging movement complicated the narrative beyond what the system could tolerate at the time. The desert highway was revisited, not physically, but conceptually. Maps were redrawn. Distances recalculated. What once seemed remote now appeared connected. The gas station receipt resurfaced, no longer a dead end, but a marker. A sign that the woman had not simply vanished where her car was found. She had traveled beyond that point, with whom remained unanswered. When the lab results finally returned, they did so quietly, without alarms, without calls in the middle of the night. Just data. Numbers. A partial profile. Incomplete. Insufficient for identification. Enough to matter. It was the first time the case had produced something new in years. Not an answer. A direction. The profile did not match anyone in existing databases. That was expected. In 1995, few profiles existed to match against. The system was young then. Limited. What mattered was not who it named, but that it existed at all. The detective understood immediately what this meant. The evidence had spoken. Not loudly, not clearly, but unmistakably. He requested familial searching authorization, a process that did not exist when the case began, one that acknowledged an uncomfortable truth, that identities could be revealed through proximity, through relation, through the unavoidable interconnectedness of people. The request triggered debate. Privacy concerns. Legal thresholds. Ethical lines. Time passed again, slower this time, measured in approvals rather than years. The family was updated once more, carefully. This time, the words carried weight. Something had changed. The case was no longer static. It was moving, however slowly. Inside the system, the case shed its dormant status. Files were flagged. Supervisors were notified. Resources were tentatively reassigned. The phrase cold case was still accurate, but it now carried motion, like ice beginning to crack under pressure. The desert remained unchanged. The highway still carried traffic. The place where the car had been found looked no different than it ever had. But beneath that surface, something irreversible had begun. The evidence had finally found a voice, and it was no longer willing to stay silent. The weight that followed was heavier than the years that came before it, because this time there was direction without destination, momentum without certainty, and the system does not handle that state comfortably. Files moved again. Meetings were scheduled and rescheduled. The case was no longer forgotten, but it was not yet believed in either, suspended in a narrow corridor where every step forward carried risk. Familial searching opened doors that traditional methods never could, but each door led to rooms filled with strangers, distant relatives linked by fragments of shared code, people who had never heard the woman's name, who did not know they were now orbiting a disappearance that predated their adult lives. Investigators approached carefully, aware that this method carried consequences beyond the case itself. The first leads felt promising, then collapsed under scrutiny. A cousin several states away. A distant uncle with a history that raised eyebrows, but led nowhere. Each elimination refined the profile without clarifying it. The net tightened, but the center remained empty. At the same time, the detective noticed resistance. Not from suspects, but from the system itself. Old cases reopening disrupts narratives people have grown comfortable with. They force institutions to confront the possibility that resolution was always closer than acknowledged. That discomfort slowed progress in ways no policy could justify openly. Still, the evidence held. The profile remained. It did not degrade. It did not contradict itself. It waited. A breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A database update, routine and uncelebrated, expanded connections that had not existed weeks earlier. A partial match appeared, faint but undeniable, pointing toward a family line that intersected with Arizona in the mid-1990s. Investigators began reconstructing lives backwards. Employment records, addresses, vehicle registrations, movement patterns that could place someone on that highway at the right time without raising suspicion. The work was slow, meticulous, unforgiving. One name surfaced more than once. Not as a suspect, as a presence. Someone whose timeline brushed the edges of the case repeatedly without ever entering the frame. A man who worked seasonal jobs. A man who traveled that corridor regularly. A man who had never been interviewed because no one had ever known to ask. The discovery unsettled the team. Not because it proved guilt, but because it explained absence. It offered a reason why the case had resisted resolution for so long. The right person had never been visible. Surveillance began quietly. Not dramatic. Not aggressive. Just observation. The man lived an unremarkable life. No obvious violence. No visible secrets. Time had wrapped him in normalcy. The family was informed only that progress continued. Names were not shared. Expectations were managed. Hope was kept at arm's length. Inside the department, the case crossed another threshold. It was no longer a question of whether something had happened. It was a question of who had carried it with them all these years without being noticed. The desert remained indifferent. The evidence remained patient. And somewhere, a man continued his routine, unaware that the past had finally learned how to find him. Surveillance teaches patience the hard way. Hours collapse into minutes, minutes stretch into nothing, and the longer investigators watched the man move through his ordinary life, the more unsettling that ordinariness became. He went to work. He bought groceries. He paid bills. He waved at neighbors, who had no idea a vanished woman's timeline was slowly tightening around him. Normalcy, in this context, felt less like innocence and more like camouflage perfected by time. Records filled in gaps the years had hidden. Employment logs placed him along the highway corridor during the same months the woman disappeared. Not every night. Not every week. Just often enough to matter. Vehicle maintenance receipts showed a truck serviced shortly after the disappearance. Interior detailing requested without explanation. The detail had once meant nothing. Now it carried weight. Investigators compared movement patterns against the original timeline. Routes overlapped. Distances aligned. The gas station receipt no longer floated without anchor. It fit. Not cleanly. Not conclusively. But with enough friction to slow denial. They moved carefully, knowing that premature contact could fracture the fragile structure they had built. The evidence needed to speak first. The man needed to remain unaware. Time, once the enemy of the case, was now its most precise instrument. In the lab, the profile was refined again. Advances had not just improved clarity, they had improved confidence. The markers held. The likelihood ratios shifted. What had once been possibility hardened into probability. Still not proof. Not yet. A second familial connection surfaced, this one closer, less distant, narrowing the field to a handful of individuals who shared proximity, opportunity, and absence from the original investigation. The circle tightened without noise. The family felt the tension without understanding its source. Calls came more often. Conversations grew more deliberate. They sensed movement and feared its consequences equally. After decades of uncertainty, any certainty, felt dangerous. Investigators prepared for contact. Not an arrest. Not an accusation. Just a conversation framed as routine. The kind that invites cooperation without revealing intent. They rehearsed questions designed to sound casual, while mapping reactions with precision. When the moment came, it arrived without drama. A knock on a door in the early evening. The man answered easily, curious but not alarmed. He agreed to talk. He smiled. He answered questions about his past with practiced vagueness, details rounded smooth by repetition. He acknowledged traveling that highway. Who hadn't? He denied remembering the woman. Why would he? But there were pauses. Small ones. Microseconds where the mask slipped just enough to register. A hesitation when dates were mentioned. A tightening around the eyes when the year 1995 surfaced. Not guilt. Not proof. Just friction between memory and performance. They thanked him. They left. Inside the vehicle, the lead investigator said nothing for several miles. Then he spoke one sentence, quiet, precise. This was no longer a question of if. It was a question of how much. The desert outside the window looked unchanged, endless and indifferent, but the case had crossed a line it could not uncross. The past had finally made contact with the present, and it had not been rejected. After contact, nothing moves quickly. That is the rule. The most dangerous moment in a long investigation is not the first search or the last arrest, but the stretch in between, when momentum exists and restraint is required to keep it from collapsing under its own weight. The team understood this. They returned to their routines deliberately, letting the man believe the knock had been meaningless, just another bureaucratic ripple in an ordinary life. Behind the scenes, the case accelerated without noise. Subpoenas were drafted with surgical precision. Phone records from decades past were requested where they still existed, fragmentary and incomplete, yet capable of confirming presence even when memory denied it. Employment logs were cross-checked against weather reports, traffic patterns, fuel purchases. The story was rebuilt not as a narrative, but as a lattice, each point supporting the next without demanding belief. The lab requested another comparison. Not to confirm what they already suspected, but to eliminate doubt before it could grow teeth in court. The evidence was handled again, with protocols that would have been unimaginable in 1995. Controls layered on controls. Redundancy designed to survive attack. When the results came back, they did not shout. They aligned. Probability tightened into near certainty. Still not a name. Still not a charge. But the margin for coincidence narrowed to something that could no longer be defended with a straight face. Investigators returned to the highway, not to search, but to understand. They stood where the car had been found and watched traffic pass, counting seconds between headlights, measuring the distance to darkness. It became clear how little time would have been needed. How easy it would have been to intervene without witnesses, to move someone into another vehicle, to leave behind a scene so clean it felt accidental. A second interview was planned. This one would be different. No small talk. No casual framing. Just questions designed to force alignment between memory and record. The man agreed again, still cooperative, still calm. The room was neutral. The tone respectful. The pressure invisible. When confronted with specifics, dates, locations, receipts, his answer shortened. He corrected himself. He asked for clarification where none was needed. He maintained composure, but it required effort now. The question of consent surfaced carefully. DNA? A swab? Routine? Voluntary? He declined. Politely. Legally. The refusal was his right. It was also a line in the sand. Investigators did not push. They did not need to. The system had other paths now. Discarded items. Public spaces. The inevitable residue of modern life. The family was told only that progress continued and that patience was still required. They had learned how to wait. Waiting no longer frightened them. What frightened them was momentum, because momentum suggested an ending, and endings carry consequences no one can rehearse for. As night fell over the desert, the case reached another quiet threshold. The kind that does not announce itself until later, when looking back makes its significance unavoidable. The man returned home. He slept. He woke. He went to work. Life continued as if nothing had shifted. But the investigation had entered a phase where outcomes no longer depended on memory or cooperation. The past had left enough behind to speak for itself, and it was beginning to do so with a clarity that time could no longer blur. Once the line of consent was crossed, the investigation changed character. It became quieter, more deliberate, less visible. Investigators no longer needed the man to speak. They needed only what he left behind, the ordinary debris of a life lived without expectation of scrutiny. A coffee cup discarded at a gas station. A cigarette but crushed into gravel. A fork abandoned on a cafeteria tray. Modern life sheds identifiers constantly. The case learned how to listen for them. Collection was meticulous and patient. Nothing was rushed. Each item was treated as if it might be the one that ended decades of uncertainty, and also as if it might be nothing at all. That balance, hope restrained by discipline, defined every move. When a usable sample was finally secured, it was transported without urgency, because urgency introduces error, and error is what cold cases cannot afford. Back at the lab, the process unfolded under scrutiny layered so thick it felt ceremonial. Analysts worked independently. Results were reviewed without names attached. Confirmation required alignment across systems designed to disagree. The profile that emerged did not surprise anyone who had been following the case closely. What surprised them was how clean the alignment was. How little room remained to argue chance. The match did not arrive as a single revelation. It accumulated. A percentage here. A ratio there. Each metric tightened the same conclusion from a different angle, until denial required invention rather than skepticism. prosecutors were briefed carefully, not with conclusions, but with foundations. They asked the questions that would be asked later, under oath, in rooms that do not forgive uncertainty. How was the evidence preserved? How was it collected? How was it interpreted then? And how is it interpreted now? Every answer had to survive time as well as scrutiny. The decision to move forward was not unanimous at first. Old cases carry risk. They invite attacks on memory, on methods, on motives. They reopen wounds institutions prefer to keep scarred over. But the evidence did not flinch. It held. A warrant followed. Quietly. Without press. Without spectacle. The man was arrested in the early hours, when routine has not yet formed defenses. He did not resist. He looked confused. He asked what this was about. The question was genuine. For him, the past had remained undisturbed for a very long time. At the station, the tone remained controlled. Facts were presented. Timelines laid out. Evidence described without flourish. The DNA match was mentioned once, clearly, without emphasis. The room changed. Not dramatically. Subtly. As if gravity had shifted. He denied involvement. He offered explanations that did not quite align. He invoked distance. Time. Forgetting. None of it contradicted the evidence directly. It simply failed to touch it. The family was notified before the news broke. They heard the words carefully, as if volume might alter meaning. An arrest. Decades later. Based on evidence that had waited longer than they had known how to hope. They did not celebrate. They sat. They breathed. They understood that this was not the end, only the moment when waiting transformed into something else. As dawn spread across the desert, reporters would soon arrive at the edges of the story, eager to compress years into headlines. But inside the case, inside the file that had aged and endured, there was no rush to speak. The truth had arrived. Now it would have to survive being heard. Courtrooms have a way of draining stories of their atmosphere, stripping mystery down to sequence and fact, but this case resisted that flattening from the start, because even as proceedings began, the weight of years pressed in from every side, bending each motion, each objection, each pause between questions. Time itself felt like a witness, seated quietly behind the gallery, impossible to dismiss. The prosecution did not rush. They understood that speed had never served this case well. Instead, they rebuilt the past piece by piece, anchoring every claim to documentation that had survived neglect, relocation, policy changes, and institutional fatigue. The desert highway returned to the record not as scenery, but as geometry. Distances measured, angles noted, windows of opportunity calculated down to seconds. What once felt like coincidence now appeared as design. Defense strategies leaned heavily on age. Memory fades. Evidence degrades. Procedures evolve. They argued that what could not be solved then should not be trusted now. It was a familiar approach, effective in many cases. Here it faltered. The evidence had not changed. Only the tools had. The chain of custody spoke with a consistency no witness could match. The DNA testimony landed without drama. No gasps. No raised voices. Just ratios, probabilities, independent confirmations. The science did not accuse. It identified. It did not speculate. It compared. And in doing so, it collapsed decades of uncertainty into a single, unavoidable alignment. The defense challenged collection methods. The lab answered with redundancy. They challenged interpretation. The lab answered with replication. Every angle of attack had been anticipated during those long, cautious months when the case was rebuilt in silence. The man at the center of it all watched without expression. He took notes. He whispered occasionally to his attorney. When the year 1995 was spoken, his eyes lifted just slightly, then returned to the table. The movement was small, but it did not go unnoticed. The family attended every session. They did not seek the defendant's gaze. Their focus stayed forward, on the process, on the discipline of it. For them, this was not about confrontation. It was about acknowledgement, about having the absence finally recognized as something that mattered enough to demand precision. As testimony concluded, the narrative closed in on itself. There were no alternate explanations left standing that did not require coincidence layered on coincidence. The lattice held. When the verdict came, it arrived without spectacle. Guilty. The word carried less triumph than gravity. It did not restore what had been taken. It did not rewind the years. It did something quieter and more permanent. It fixed the truth in place. Outside, the desert looked the same as it always had. The highway carried on. Wind moved sand across the shoulder where a car had once sat with its door open, waiting for a story to resume. The case, once cold, now belonged to history. But the lesson it left behind was active, moving forward into other files, other shelves, other moments where patience would be tested again. Because this story was never just about how a woman disappeared. It was about what happens when time fails to erase the truth. And what it costs to wait long enough to hear it. Closure is a word people reach for too quickly. It sounds clean, decisive, like a door being shut at last, but in reality it behaves more like a slow pressure change, barely noticeable at first, then gradually altering how everything feels to breathe. After the verdict, there was no sudden release inside the community, no collective exhale that swept away the years. What followed instead was adjustment, the subtle and uneasy process of learning how to live with an answer that had arrived far later than anyone expected. For investigators, the case did not simply end. Files were not closed with a single stamp. Reports continued to be written, internal reviews conducted, timelines revisited not to prove guilt, but to understand failure. Why it had taken so long. Where momentum had stalled. Which assumptions had calcified into blind spots. Cold cases are unforgiving teachers. They wait decades, then demand accountability all at once. The desert highway was visited again, not by detectives this time, but by engineers and surveyors, people tasked with evaluating how many other moments like that one might still be hidden in plain sight. Poor lighting. Limited sightlines. Long stretches without surveillance. Geography, once neutral, was now suspect. The man's history was pulled apart quietly. Not for headlines, but for patterns. Prior complaints that never escalated. Moves that coincided with unresolved incidents elsewhere. None of it changed the verdict, but all of it deepened the understanding of how easily violence can move through systems designed to see it. The family found themselves navigating an unfamiliar terrain. Sympathy shifted in tone. Questions changed. Instead of asking how they endured not knowing, people now asked how it felt to finally know. The answer was never simple. Knowing did not replace the years of absence. It only reframed them. Every unanswered phone call, every birthday marked by silence, every holiday that passed with an empty chair now carried a different weight. Not lighter, just defined. They visited the site together once, standing where the car had been found decades earlier. Traffic moved past them without slowing. No marker identified the place. No sign explained its significance. That anonymity felt appropriate. The story had never belonged to the road. The road had only borrowed it briefly. In training rooms across the state, the case began to circulate as an example. Not of brilliance, but of persistence. Of what happens when evidence is preserved even when hope is not. Young investigators listened as older ones explained how close the truth had been for so long, waiting behind limitations that no longer existed. The lesson was quiet but insistent. Never assume time is the enemy. Sometimes it is the ally no one knows how to use yet. Media attention faded, as it always does. Headlines gave way to newer shocks, fresher crimes, more urgent tragedies. But within certain circles, the case remained active, referenced in policy discussions, cited in grant proposals, used to justify investments in technology that might one day shorten the wait for someone else. The man began serving his sentence. The routine of incarceration flattened his days into predictability. Appeals were filed, expected, procedural. None introduced evidence strong enough to disturb what had already settled. The truth, once fixed, proved resistant to erosion. And somewhere between official reviews and private reckonings, the case completed its final transformation. It stopped being an open wound and became a scar. Still visible. Still sensitive. But no longer bleeding. The desert did not remember the story. It never does. People do. And sometimes, when enough of them refuse to forget, even the coldest case eventually learns how to speak. Time did not stop moving once the case was solved. It never does. What changed was the way it moved through people. For years, the story had existed as a question mark hanging over conversations, an unfinished sentence everyone learned to speak around. Now it had punctuation. Finality altered the rhythm of memory, forcing the past to reorganize itself around a truth that could no longer be avoided. Former investigators returned to the case in private moments, replaying decisions they had made when the evidence was thin and the pressure heavy. They remembered the frustration of dead ends, the uneasy silence after leads collapsed, the quiet dread of knowing someone's life had been reduced to an unsolved file number. Solving the case did not erase those memories. It reframed them. Every misstep became part of a longer endurance test, one that had finally reached its limit. In the community, the name of the victim began to surface again, not as a mystery, but as a person. Stories emerged that had nothing to do with her disappearance. Her laugh. Her impatience. The way she planned trips with unnecessary detail. For decades, she had been defined by how she vanished. Now people tried, gently and imperfectly, to remember how she lived. The highway patrol adjusted protocols quietly, not because of public demand, but because the case had exposed a vulnerability that could not be ignored. Training emphasized response time, documentation, the importance of treating abandoned vehicles not as inconveniences, but as potential turning points. These changes did not carry her name, but they carried her absence in their design. Legal analysts debated the case in journals and conferences. They spoke about the balance between due process and delayed justice, about the risks of relying on evidence collected under outdated standards, about the ethical weight of prosecuting someone decades after the fact. The debates were rigorous, sometimes uncomfortable, but they circled the same conclusion: time complicates justice, but it does not invalidate it. The family learned to say the word after the verdict, after the sentence, after the appeals. It was a word they had not been able to use for a very long time. Planning returned slowly. Not optimism, exactly, but direction. They no longer lived suspended between hope and dread. They lived with certainty, and certainty, even when painful, has a strange stabilizing effect. Letters arrived from strangers. Some were clumsy, some intrusive. Others simply said that the story had mattered to them, that it had changed how they thought about waiting, about loss, about the idea that truth can survive neglect if it is protected carefully enough. The family read what they could. The rest they set aside. Not everything needs to be carried forward. Inside evidence rooms, technicians revisited shelves once considered exhausted. Cases were retagged. Old envelopes reopened. Not because every file would produce a revelation, but because this one had proven that patience paired with progress can resurrect voices thought permanently silent. The case did not inspire miracles. It inspired effort. The man's appeals continued, thinning with each rejection. The arguments grew narrower, more technical, less persuasive. Courts answered with brief orders, language stripped of drama. The system, having spoken clearly once, did not feel compelled to repeat itself. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the case began to loosen its grip on daily life. It did not disappear. It settled. Like dust after a storm, it found surfaces to rest on and stayed there, visible but no longer blinding. The story was no longer about what might have happened. It was about what had endured. Evidence. Memory. The refusal to let time be the final verdict. Long after the courtroom emptied, the case continued to echo in quieter places. It surfaced in late-night conversations among detectives who had never worked it, who had been rookies when the disappearance first hit the wires, who now studied it as a reminder that some investigations are measured not in weeks, but in lifetimes. The file became less a record of one crime and more a map of endurance, showing where resolve held and where it thinned. The desert highway remained unchanged, yet its meaning had shifted. For those who knew the story, it was no longer just a stretch of asphalt cutting through scrub and heat. It was proof of how easily violence can vanish into routine, how an ordinary location can host an extraordinary silence. Cars still broke down there. Drivers still waited for help. But now, somewhere in the back of every responding officer's mind, the memory of 1995 lingered like a warning that demanded attention. In the evidence archive, the original items were sealed again, not as forgotten artifacts but as milestones. Each label told two stories at once, what had been missed, and what had survived long enough to matter. The case no longer accused the past, it instructed the future. The family's grief evolved into something quieter, more internal. Public sympathy faded, but their relationship with time had permanently changed. They marked years differently now, not by the anniversary of the disappearance, but by the moment justice finally arrived. The gap between those dates defined a generation. They spoke occasionally at small gatherings, never theatrically, never with rehearsed answers. They spoke about waiting, about the exhaustion of hope, about the strange discipline required to keep believing without expectation. Their words carried weight because they were not lessons. They were lived realities, offered without demand. In private, they sorted through belongings long stored away. Not everything felt necessary to keep. Some objects had served their purpose simply by surviving until the truth emerged. Letting go did not feel like betrayal anymore. It felt like permission. Within law enforcement, the case triggered audits that extended far beyond Arizona. Agencies reviewed how they cataloged evidence, how they preserved biological material, how they documented scenes that seemed unremarkable at the time. The lesson was uncomfortable. Many cases had gone cold not because answers were impossible, but because the tools to reach them had not yet arrived. Technology seminars referenced the case frequently, not as a miracle of science, but as a reminder that science only works when patience protects its raw materials. Evidence lost is silence. Evidence preserved is potential. The difference between the two can span decades. Young analysts listened carefully. They understood that someday, someone else might rely on what they chose to save today. The man behind bars grew older. Prison flattened him into routine, stripping away the layers that had once allowed him to blend unnoticed into ordinary life. His name appeared less frequently in print. His appeals dwindled. He became less a figure of fascination and more a fixed point in the system's machinery. What remained was not his story, but the absence he had created. The crime no longer belonged to him. It belonged to those who had carried its weight while he moved forward untouched. Justice did not restore balance. It acknowledged imbalance and refused to look away. Even in confinement, time continued its work. It reduced noise. It left only consequence. The case began appearing in academic studies, framed through lenses of forensic evolution and institutional memory. Scholars debated how many similar answers still slept inside storage rooms and forgotten databases. Estimates varied. The conclusion did not. There were more. Each discussion returned to the same haunting idea. Resolution is often limited not by truth, but by timing. The wrong decade can bury certainty. The right one can exhume it intact. For families still waiting, the case offered something fragile but real, not assurance, but precedent. Years later, a junior investigator stood alone at the archive shelf where the file once lived. He had never met the victim. He had never driven that highway in 1995. But he understood what the case represented. He traced the spine of the folder with his finger and felt the weight of its journey. He pulled another box from a nearby shelf. Another cold case. Different year. Different names. Same silence. The work continued not because success was guaranteed, but because failure was unacceptable. This was the inheritance the case left behind. Time has a second life after justice, one that few people ever talk about. It is quieter than the years of waiting, heavier than the moment of resolution. It settles into routines, into habits, into the spaces where absence once screamed and now only whispers. For this case, that second life began not with relief, but with a question no verdict could answer. What does a community do once the mystery that shaped it finally releases its grip? The town did not hold a ceremony. There were no plaques, no official markers, no speeches about healing. Instead, life resumed in a way that felt almost disrespectful in its normality. The same cafes opened at the same hours. The same intersections clogged at rush hour. Teenagers who had not been born when the woman vanished now drove past the stretch of highway where everything had stopped, unaware that it had ever mattered. This was not erasure. It was absorption. Tragedy had been folded into the background, where most truths eventually end up. Inside law enforcement offices, the case became something else entirely. It was no longer a file to be solved, but a reference point. Detectives cited it when younger officers questioned the value of preserving evidence that seemed useless. Supervisors mentioned it when budgets tightened and storage costs were scrutinized. The story had matured into a warning, not a myth. It taught without drama. It insisted without shouting. Cold cases have a strange gravity. Even when resolved, they continue pulling attention inward, drawing other unresolved files into their orbit. Investigators began reopening cases from the same decade, the same corridors, the same stretches of desert road. Patterns were not assumed, but neither were they ignored. The lesson of 1995 was clear now. Coincidence should never be trusted too easily, especially when time has silenced witnesses and softened memory. The technology that finally broke the case did not stop evolving. Databases expanded. Algorithms refined. What had once required months of lab work could now be completed in weeks, sometimes days. But speed did not bring certainty. It only increased responsibility. Every advancement raised the stakes of preservation. What was saved today might become decisive tomorrow. What was discarded might become regret. For the family, the second life of time felt different. They were no longer waiting for answers, but learning how to live without the question that had organized their days for decades. It was disorienting. Grief had become familiar, almost functional. Resolution disrupted that familiarity. There were moments when they caught themselves expecting a phone call that would never come, bracing for a disappointment that had already passed. The mind does not update as quickly as facts. They spoke less about the crime now, and more about the years surrounding it. The before, the after, The moments that had been overshadowed by uncertainty. Weddings remembered through the haze of absence. Birthdays marked quietly, cautiously, never sure whether hope was appropriate. With the truth fixed in place, these memories began to breathe again. Painful, yes, but no longer suspended. In the prison system, the man convicted of the crime faded into routine. His presence no longer carried narrative weight. He was processed, classified, monitored. Appeals moved slowly, predictably, grinding against legal standards that no longer bent in his favor. He was no longer central to the story. He was its consequence. The distinction mattered. Meanwhile, the case reached people far beyond Arizona. Podcasts dissected it. Documentaries reconstructed it with moody lighting and measured voices. Some treatments honored the facts. Others chased sensation. This was inevitable. Stories that survive decades attract interpretation. Not all of it is careful. Not all of it is kind. The family learned to ignore most of it. They had already endured the worst distortion of all, not knowing. In academic circles, the case was cited in discussions about delayed justice. Professors asked whether truth discovered late was still justice, or merely accuracy. The answer was debated vigorously, but the case itself offered a quiet rebuttal. It did not argue philosophy. It demonstrated consequence. A life interrupted. A family altered. A community shaped by uncertainty. Time did not neutralize harm. It only postponed accountability. The desert continued to offer no commentary. It never does. Wind erased tracks. Heat warped distance. The landscape remained indifferent, as it always had been. And yet, for those who knew the story, the highway was no longer anonymous. It had acquired a second layer, invisible but persistent, a reminder that even the most unremarkable places can carry unspeakable weight. One evening, years after the verdict, a young detective stood alone at that same stretch of road. Not on assignment. Not officially. Just standing, watching headlights cut through darkness. He imagined how quickly a life could be diverted there. How little noise it would take. How easily the moment could be missed. The thought stayed with him long after he left. Cold cases teach patience, but they also teach vigilance. They reveal how fragile certainty is, how dependent it is on effort, memory, and restraint. This case had survived because someone had chosen not to throw something away. Because someone had believed that the future might need what the present could not yet use. As the years moved forward, the story receded from headlines, from conversations, from daily consciousness. But it did not disappear. It embedded itself into systems, into training manuals, into instincts. It became part of how people thought about silence, about waiting, about the long arc between disappearance and truth. Justice had spoken finally. But its echo was still moving. Through files not yet reopened. Through evidence not yet tested. Through futures that would one day depend on decisions made quietly, without recognition, in the shadow of a case that refused to stay buried. Long after the case stopped being discussed in briefings and courtrooms, it continued to live in the margins of decision-making, in the subtle hesitations that precede action. This is where the true afterlife of a cold case exists, not in headlines or verdicts, but in the instinct to pause, to look again, to refuse the convenience of dismissal. The Arizona case had become a quiet presence, a reminder that certainty is often provisional, and that the past does not always stay where it is placed. In evidence rooms across the state, shelves were reorganized. Not dramatically, not ceremonially, just carefully. Boxes once labeled inactive were reclassified. Old protocols were reviewed against new capabilities. The work was methodical, almost meditative. No one expected miracles. What they expected was accountability, to the future as much as to the past. The shift was psychological as much as procedural. Investigators began to speak differently about time, not as an adversary, but as a variable. Time could degrade memories, yes, but it could also preserve truth if handled correctly. The Arizona case had survived because someone decades earlier had chosen to preserve something that seemed insignificant. That decision now echoed in rooms far removed from the desert highway where it all began. For families still waiting on answers elsewhere, the story traveled like a rumor with substance. It reached support groups, online forums, quiet conversations held after meetings ended. People shared it not as proof that every case would be solved, but as evidence that patience was not foolish. That hope, when disciplined, could coexist with realism. For many, that distinction mattered more than certainty ever could. The family at the center of the case withdrew from public view, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Grief, once stretched across decades, demanded privacy now that it had room to unfold properly. They spent time together without the shared task of waiting. Silence between them felt different, less heavy, more neutral. They were learning a new rhythm, one without an unanswered question at its core. Memory behaved unpredictably during this phase. Small details surfaced unexpectedly. A comment overheard years earlier. A gesture once dismissed. These recollections did not change the outcome, but they changed the texture of remembrance. The past was no longer a void. It was a landscape with contours, shadows, and edges that could finally be seen. The convicted man's presence faded further into institutional routine. His name appeared only in legal documents, his story reduced to citations and footnotes. Appeals were denied with increasing brevity. The system, having satisfied its obligation to fairness, no longer lingered. Justice does not dwell. It moves on. Meanwhile, the case continued to influence training in subtle ways. Instructors no longer framed cold cases as failures. They framed them as deferred questions. They taught recruits to think in layers, to imagine evidence not only as proof for today, but as testimony for a future that might understand it better. This reframing did not make the work easier. It made it more honest. The desert remained unchanged, but its symbolism evolved. It was no longer merely a place of disappearance. It became a reminder of scale, how small human certainty can be against vast, indifferent space. And yet, the case proved that scale does not negate responsibility. Even in places where no one is watching, actions leave traces. Sometimes those traces wait patiently to be understood. As years passed, the story settled into its final form, not as a mystery, not even as a solved crime, but as a lesson embedded in practice. It influenced budgets. It justified patience. It discouraged shortcuts. It reminded people that absence does not equal insignificance. Cold cases are often described as frozen, but that has never been accurate. They are not static. They are suspended, waiting for conditions to change. The Arizona case waited for technology, for perspective, for someone willing to reopen what had been quietly set aside. And when those conditions aligned, it spoke clearly, without embellishment or apology. The echo of that clarity continued outward, touching cases that would never make headlines, families who would never hear a verdict, investigators who would never see resolution. Even there, its influence mattered. It insisted on care. It demanded memory. It argued, silently but persistently, against the idea that time alone decides what deserves attention. In the end, the case did not offer comfort. It offered responsibility. To remember. To preserve. To wait without surrendering effort. And somewhere, in a file not yet reopened, that responsibility was already being tested again. There comes a moment, long after a case has been resolved, when its meaning detaches from the specifics that once defined it. Names fade first. Dates follow. What remains is a pressure, subtle but persistent, shaping decisions that seem unrelated on the surface. The Arizona case reached that moment quietly. It no longer needed to be cited aloud. It had become internalized, folded into the collective judgment of those who carried its lessons forward. In briefing rooms, younger investigators listened to veterans speak about intuition with unusual caution. The old language of gut feeling had been tempered by something harder earned: restraint. They talked about how easy it is to mistake familiarity for understanding, how often early assumptions harden into obstacles rather than guides. The case had taught them that the most dangerous confidence is the kind that feels reasonable. Evidence, once treated as a finite resource, began to be discussed as a long-term investment. Storage was no longer an afterthought. Preservation was no longer clerical. Decisions about what to keep were framed with a question that had gained new authority: what if this matters later? Not because technology would necessarily advance, but because perspective would. Outside official spaces, the case lived on in a different way. It became part of the cultural memory of unresolved loss, cited in conversations about patience and accountability. People referenced it when discussing other disappearances, other silences that felt permanent. It did not promise outcomes. It suggested endurance. The family's relationship with the story continued to evolve. They no longer corrected inaccuracies unless they mattered. They no longer felt compelled to educate strangers. Their energy shifted inward, toward relationships that had been paused, delayed, stretched thin by years of uncertainty. The absence that had once dominated everything now existed alongside other realities. It was still present, but it no longer demanded constant attention. There were moments when the finality of the verdict felt unreal. Decades of waiting had trained them to expect disappointment, to brace for collapse. Resolution required a different kind of strength. It required accepting that nothing more was coming. No revelation. No reversal. Just time, moving forward without resistance. The case influenced policy in places far removed from its origin. Grants were approved with its name buried in justifications. Databases expanded because it had proven their worth. Training modules referenced it without naming it, embedding its logic into scenarios and hypotheticals. The story had become infrastructure. The desert highway, still anonymous to most, continued to function as it always had. Accidents happened. Cars broke down. Lives intersected briefly, and then moved on. Yet for those who knew, the road carried an additional dimension. It was a reminder that vulnerability does not announce itself, that violence often hides behind the ordinary. In prisons, time flattened everything equally. The man convicted of the crime aged into obscurity. His name no longer provoked reaction. He was processed, counted, moved. The system did not seek meaning from him anymore. Meaning had already been extracted and placed elsewhere, where it could do some good. Cold cases often end twice. The first ending is procedural: the verdict, the sentence, the closing of a file. The second ending is cultural. It occurs when the case stops being exceptional and starts being instructive. Arizona's reached that point slowly, almost imperceptibly. It no longer shocked. It informed. Investigators, who had never worked the case, felt its influence when they hesitated before discarding an item, when they pushed back against pressure to close a file prematurely, when they chose documentation over convenience. These were small acts, invisible ones, but they were the true legacy. The story did not inspire heroism. It inspired care. It did not glorify persistence. It normalized it. It reframed waiting not as passivity, but as preparation. These distinctions mattered more than any dramatic retelling ever could. As years continued to pass, the case slipped further from public memory. That was inevitable. Attention moves on. But in the quiet places where decisions are made without applause, it remained present. A reference point. A warning. A promise that effort, even delayed, can still matter. The Arizona cold case no longer asked to be remembered. It asked to be applied. And in that request, it continued to live. Not as a story told, but as a standard held. In the end, the case did not fade so much as it thinned, spreading itself across places where no single person could point to it and say, "This is where it lives now." Its presence became diffuse, woven into habits and hesitations, into the quiet calculus that happens before decisions are made. This is how long stories survive, not by being retold endlessly, but by changing the way people think when no one is watching. Years after the verdict, a different disappearance crossed a detective's desk. Different city. Different circumstances. On the surface, nothing connected it to Arizona, to 1995, to the desert highway that had once carried so much unanswered weight. And yet, the file was handled differently because of that older case. Evidence was cataloged with excess care. Timelines were challenged early. Assumptions were treated like hazards rather than shortcuts. No one mentioned the Arizona case aloud, but its influence shaped every move. This was how legacy functioned, quietly, effectively, without ceremony. The concept of "too old to solve" began to lose credibility. Not entirely. Some cases truly lacked what was needed, but the phrase no longer ended conversations. It started them. Investigators learned to ask not whether a case was old, but whether it had been preserved, whether it had been protected against the future long enough to benefit from it. Age alone was no longer disqualifying. Neglect was. The family rarely spoke publicly anymore. When they did, their words were measured, almost spare. They did not frame the story as a triumph. They framed it as a responsibility fulfilled late, but still fulfilled. They understood that their experience could be misread as reassurance, and they resisted that. There was nothing reassuring about decades of absence. What they offered instead was perspective, that answers, when they come, do not erase the waiting, but they do prevent it from becoming meaningless. Their private lives grew fuller in ways that surprised them. Laughter returned without guilt. Plans extended beyond the next obligation. The future no longer felt like a betrayal of the past. This was not healing in the way people like to imagine it. It was adaptation. It was learning to carry certainty where uncertainty had once lived. In institutional spaces, the case continued to generate quiet reforms. Evidence retention policies were extended. Funding for cold case units stabilized in jurisdictions that had once treated them as optional. The logic was simple now, backed by precedent rather than hope. Preservation pays dividends, even if the return arrives decades later. Technology kept moving forward, indifferent to the stories that depended on it. New methods promised new answers. Old cases waited, patient as ever. The Arizona file, long since closed, became a benchmark, proof that progress does not always announce itself, and that breakthroughs often arrive not because of sudden inspiration, but because of sustained care. The desert, unchanged, remained the least reliable witness of all. It held no memory of what had happened there. It offered no testimony. And yet, for those who knew, it symbolized the central tension of the case. How something so vast could hide something so specific for so long. The answer, it turned out, had never been the landscape. It had been human limitation. Cold cases expose that limitation without mercy. They show how much depends on timing, resources, attention. They reveal the fragility of truth when it is left unattended. But they also show something else, something easier to miss. That truth, when preserved carefully, can outlast neglect. As the years continued, the Arizona case receded further into institutional memory. New investigators learned its lessons secondhand, absorbed through policy and practice rather than story. This was not a loss. It was the final stage of integration. The case had done its work. It no longer demanded to be remembered. It no longer needed to be told. It existed now as a quiet influence, shaping outcomes it would never be credited for, protecting futures it would never see. And in that invisibility, it achieved something rare. It changed the world without insisting on recognition. One part remained. Not a revelation. Not a twist. Just the long, final echo of a question answered at last. And the responsibility that answer left behind. Every story reaches a point where it stops asking to be continued. Not because everything has been said, but because what remains cannot be carried forward without becoming something else. This is where the Arizona case finally arrived, not at silence, but at stillness. A place where movement no longer meant progress, and reflection became the only honest form of motion left. Years had passed since the verdict, enough time for new crises to dominate attention, for other names to take up space in headlines and hearings. The case no longer surfaced uninvited. It was summoned only when needed, referenced with economy, its contours already understood by those who mattered. That, more than any memorial, marked its true conclusion. The family lived ordinary days now, not untouched by the past, but no longer governed by it. Grief had found a stable shape, one that did not demand explanation or defense. They spoke of her freely, without lowering their voices, without bracing for discomfort. Her name was no longer a signal of tragedy. It was simply her name again. That change, subtle and private, mattered more than any public acknowledgement ever could. Sometimes, they wondered what might have happened if the case had been solved sooner. The question appeared without warning, usually late at night, usually unanswered. They had learned not to chase it. Speculation does not heal. It only multiplies loss. The truth, when it finally arrived, had done what it could. It had fixed the past in place. The future was theirs alone. In law enforcement circles, the case reached myth status without the exaggeration myths usually require. It was invoked sparingly, almost reverently, when discussions turned to evidence preservation or delayed justice. No one argued with its implications anymore. It had removed doubt by surviving it. That endurance carried authority no directive could match. Young investigators encountered the case not as a story, but as an assumption embedded in their training. Preserve everything. Document relentlessly. Question early certainty. Expect that the future will know more than you do. These principles were not framed as optimism. They were framed as obligation. The Arizona case had clarified the cost of neglect too thoroughly to be ignored. Somewhere in an archive, the physical remnants of the investigation rested undisturbed. They would likely never be touched again. They no longer needed to be. Their purpose had been fulfilled. Evidence, once so fragile, had outlived doubt, survived indifference, and delivered truth across decades. That alone made it extraordinary. The desert highway remained unmarked. No sign told passers-by what had unfolded there. No warning suggested that this place, like any other, could become a turning point without notice. Perhaps that was fitting. The case had never been about the road. It had been about what people carried with them when they traveled it: assumptions, attention, vulnerability. Cold cases often end with answers, but they never end with relief. Relief suggests restoration, and nothing is restored when time has already taken its share. What cold cases offer instead is alignment. Between fact and memory. Between loss and acknowledgement. Between silence and record. The Arizona case achieved that alignment at last. It did not redeem the past. It stabilized it. It prevented it from drifting further into speculation and rumor. It anchored truth where uncertainty had once lived, and in doing so, It allowed everyone touched by it to move without carrying the extra weight of not knowing. There will always be other cold cases, other files, other families waiting for the world to catch up. This story does not promise them resolution. It promises only that waiting is not wasted when it is paired with care. That preservation is an act of faith grounded in discipline. That truth, when given enough time and protection, can survive even the longest neglect. And so the story closes not with a revelation, but with a condition, a standard, a quiet insistence that no absence is too old to matter, that no silence is final if it is remembered correctly, that justice, even delayed, still reshapes the world it arrives in. The case is over, but its shadow remains, stretching forward, not backward, touching decisions yet to be made, waiting patiently, as it always has, for someone to choose not to look away. Even after a story ends, it sometimes refuses to stay still. It drifts. It resurfaces in places that have nothing to do with its origin. This is what happened next, not a continuation of events, but a continuation of influence, the kind that moves without asking permission. Somewhere far from Arizona, in a different state, an evidence technician paused over a box marked routine. The label was old, the contents unremarkable. A swab, a fiber, a note written in a hand that had since retired. The pause lasted only a second, but it mattered. The technician remembered a case from training, one discussed not for its drama, but for its patience. A case that waited decades for the world to catch up. The box was logged again instead of discarded. No one applauded. No one noticed. The moment passed. Years later, it would matter. This is how cold cases truly propagate, not as stories, but as interruptions in habit. The Arizona file had taught people how fragile certainty really is. How much of what feels settled is simply unexamined. That lesson moved quietly through institutions, altering decisions too small to headline, too procedural to celebrate. It altered how people treated silence. It made absence suspicious. It forced the uncomfortable acknowledgement that unresolved does not mean unsolvable. The family never knew about these ripple effects. They did not need to. Their relationship with the case had narrowed to something deeply personal. They visited fewer places connected to the past. They stopped checking news alerts. The story had given them everything it was capable of giving. Anything more would have been noise. Sometimes, though, memory intruded. Not violently. Gently. A song on the radio. A passing remark. A stretch of road that looked wrong in the light. These moments did not reopen wounds. They confirmed scars. The difference mattered. Scars mean survival. They mean something has ended, even if it left a mark. For investigators who had worked the case late in their careers, retirement brought unexpected reflection. Without the constant pressure of open files, they finally allowed themselves to feel what the case had cost them. The sleepless nights. The quiet frustration of knowing they were close without being capable. Solving it had not erased that toll. It validated it. It proved the effort had not been misplaced. They spoke about it less as time passed, but when they did not emphasize the arrest or the verdict. They talked about the moment when the evidence finally aligned. When the past, preserved imperfectly but faithfully, had spoken clearly enough to be heard. That moment, more than any other, defined success for them. The convicted man continued to age in confinement. His presence receded into statistics, into reports that measured time in increments of compliance and decline. The system did not seek closure from him anymore. Closure had never been his to give. What mattered was that the truth no longer depended on his denial or his memory. It stood without him. Cold cases, when solved, often inspire a dangerous illusion that persistence guarantees resolution. The Arizona case resisted that illusion. It did not promise outcomes. It demonstrated conditions: preservation, patience, integrity. Without those, time only deepens silence. With them, time can become an ally. This distinction became clearer as years passed. Other cases were reopened and went nowhere. Evidence had been lost. Records incomplete. Stories fragmented beyond repair. The Arizona case did not diminish those failures. It contextualized them. It showed what was required, and how rare it is to meet those requirements consistently. Somewhere in the future, long after the last person directly connected to the case is gone, the file will still exist. Not as an active investigation, not as a mystery, but as proof that truth can survive neglect when it is guarded carefully enough. That survival, quiet and uncelebrated, may be the most important legacy of all. The desert will remain unchanged. Roads will be resurfaced. Landmarks renamed. Memory will fade where it always does. But systems will remember. Practices will remember. Decisions will remember. And sometimes, that is enough. Stories like this do not end with silence. They end with vigilance. With a pause before dismissal. With a hand choosing to keep instead of discard. With a future investigator standing over a box and wondering, not if it matters now, but if it might matter later. The Arizona case taught the world how to wait responsibly. And long after its name fades, that lesson will still be working. Quietly, relentlessly. Wherever someone decides not to look away.